Hey internet, it's Phil and welcome to Storycraft. I got a suggestion on the last Storycraft that really got my brain gears moving. How does one avoid edge while writing a story that they feel needs to have a little gristle to it? This is a great question because it's something that's really relevant to the current cultural landscape. The term dark and gritty reboot has become kind of an ubiquitous joke, but it's also something that's still happening all the time. A lot of dormant franchises have been brought back in the past few years with a more serious or dark tone. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Dark stories and edgy stories aren't bad, they can be great, but it's become a jokey idea recently, I think because it's sometimes done in a really ham-fisted and tone-deaf way. Edgy by definition isn't bad on its own, but it's gotten a bit of a reputation. So the question is, how do you use darkness and edge in a way that's natural, fits the world you're making, and is entertaining and fun for the audience? First, we should define dark and edgy. Let's head over to the old dictionary. So dark, characterized by tragedy, unhappiness, or unpleasantness. Simple enough. Edgy, at the forefront of a trend, experimental or avant-garde. That one we need to work with a little. So the broad definition of edge is just about being new and different or on the edges of what's considered acceptable, but its association with dark stories is a little more recent. It's often used as an internet insult or joke now, but back in the 80s and 90s, edge became a goal for a lot of our media. Censorship standards were changing, and there was a desire for entertainment to become a little more adult, to challenge the limits of sex, violence, and morality in a way that couldn't be done before. In my mind, there's no better place to look for this than comics. Comic book history is long and complicated, but in the mid-80s there was a boom of dark and violent mainstream comic books following the publication of works such as The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. These comics were massively popular with adults, and after decades of comics being ruthlessly scrutinized and censored, there was a strong desire to play to an older audience that had somewhat left comics behind. They may have overshot that one slightly. In the 90s, the word extreme took comics by the throat and refused to let go. Comics were bloodier and sexier, everyone had pouches and gun belts and mullets. Even the art became quite literally edgier as a more angular, aggressive style took over, culminating with the creation of Image Comics and the subsequent attempts to emulate their style from Marvel and DC. I think we can mostly agree that even though some of this work was amazing, in general this was kind of a weird time for comics. What's important to note is that while it's fun to laugh at the missteps, this period was exploratory. People were telling stories in a mainstream medium that they couldn't have a few years earlier. When you're writing stories on the edge of what is considered acceptable or normal, there's no guideline to tell you what's too far. It's a really nebulous concept and that makes it tough to work with, but I think we at least have a good understanding of how it's used in media. So getting back to our topic, how do we get dark and edgy right? First rule, it has to be natural. I've been trying to think of the difference between effective and ineffective dark and edgy, and I think what it comes down to is this. A lot of the time, dark stories feel like the darkness came from a boardroom. It's put there by people who don't actually care about it or why it exists, but rather think it needs to be there for whatever demographic they're targeting. Especially with properties that were traditionally lighter and are remade to be dark, I think the fear from the producer perspective is that it won't be taken seriously. The kids today want violence and frowning, and aging executive screams, and so it happens and it just feels dishonest. It results in reboots that lack the spirit and fun of the original and seem afraid to embrace the things you liked about them to begin with. It's a hard thing to quantify, but I think we've all felt it at some point. A story that's just violent or depressing for its own sake without really adding to the story or feeling like it's a purely artistic choice. And even if it is purely artistic, sometimes it just doesn't work if it doesn't feel natural. For a great recent example, we can look to the movies Man of Steel and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. Now, to be clear, I don't hate either of these movies, I think the latter is actually pretty okay, but I do share the feeling a lot of people had that they're just way too dour and pessimistic for mainstream Superman stories. There's a ton of pathos to be found in Clark Kent, but when that's his entire character, it's just not that fun or entertaining, at least not as a headliner. I think that aside from his body count, most people had a much more positive reaction to the Batman side of Batman v Superman, because that sort of thing is what we expect from the character and it just fit his world more. Let's contrast that with the Injustice games and comics, which have such a dark take on the DC universe that Superman is the main villain, and yet that story is praised and beloved. We could do a whole video on the differences, but if I had to boil it down, Injustice is still fun, colorful, and wacky. It doesn't take itself as deadly seriously as the films do, and as a result, we're willing to buy the edge of, say, Superman ripping out Joker's heart, because it's played in a way that makes it feel better than anything Superman does in the movies, even though he's not nearly as violent there. Now, this doesn't mean every dark story has to be wacky and colorful either. Valiant Hearts: The Great War is an incredible World War I video game that has a ton of historical accuracy. This means that it is unrelentingly grim a lot of the time, but in this case it feels natural based on the setting, and the story is designed to facilitate this. You need to keep in mind your setting and how every aspect of your story supports the tone. Another great example I really love is BioShock. Rapture is a decrepit barren city filled with insane drug addicts all killing each other and you as part of a ceaseless war that destroyed their utopia. It's pretty messed up, but the sadness, anger, and destruction of BioShock are all an extension of the central themes and ideas. It's a result of the ideology and technology a rapture collapsing under their own weight. It fits the world, it fits the message, it fits the story, and everything is built around it. It doesn't feel forced, it doesn't feel fake, it's just engrossing and interesting. But look what happens when things go too far. In Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow is a fun counterpoint to Sonic, and he has just a little bit of edge to him to make him kinda cool. He makes fun of you, frames you for crimes, broods, and then sacrifices himself for the greater good. Then we get Shadow the Hedgehog, a game where you can gun down the President of the United States. Do you see the difference? There's a tone you expect from Sonic, and you can absolutely play with it, making it more lighthearted or serious based on the specific story you're telling. But Shadow is a game that takes itself so seriously, that seems to so wholeheartedly believe that Shadow using a gun, riding a motorcycle, and killing people is genuinely cool, that it is absolutely impossible to take it seriously. That being said, for the record, I legitimately love Shadow the Hedgehog. I think it's an absurd, unintentional masterpiece, but it's definitely not done on purpose. So for us as writers, the takeaway here is don't force it. Don't make something violent or dark because you think you should or because it will be successful, because ultimately it's going to backfire if the audience doesn't buy it. Where we tend to see edgy used as a pejorative rather than a good thing is when there's a perception that the work is trying too hard. So how do you avoid this? Again, it's more of a feeling than something quantifiable, so what you need is self-reflection. Look at your work from a variety of angles to see if you're taking things too far, and be willing to tweak things if so. You won't be compromising your original vision if things aren't quite as dark as you originally imagined. Remember, darkness and edge are tools. You need to use them in conjunction with the rest of your toolkit to make a cohesive whole. Another thing to keep in mind is that you don't want the darkness to be overwhelming. A funny thing happened last year. I saw a bunch of articles with a lot of comments supporting them about people who had started to feel that the Walking Dead TV show was too depressing. Now, this wasn't people tuning in for the first time. These were people who had been watching for 7 years, enjoying the misery and violence that was the show's MO. There's a lot to unpack there, but even without specifics, I think there's an important lesson there. You can get darkness fatigue. Even if people are attracted to your story because of its dark or edgy elements, there's a point where it can get overwhelming and it stops being fun. This is again something that's not quite concrete but more of a feeling thing, so we have to take a step back every once in a while and evaluate. If the suffering just comes and doesn't let up, it might take people out of the story and it won't be as effective anymore. It's also worth noting that this happened 7 seasons into The Walking Dead. In a lot of zombie movies, the end is everyone dying or things generally being awful, but if it's only 2 hours of your time, it's a lot easier to deal with. The longer your story is, the more likely that really heavy or stressful elements that are its strength can become tiresome. This happens a lot in video games too. RPGs can go up to 70 hours or more without wearing out their welcome, but you don't find a lot of horror games going past 10 or 20 hours because not only is it tough to keep up scares for that long, but people just start to get tired of that tense feeling. I know a lot of people felt that the final act of Outlast took the terrifying chases that made the game so fun and overused them to the point where it just became irritating. If this happens, especially towards the end, it can color people's memories of the whole work and that will be their major takeaway. Overall, this is kind of a difficult topic to cover comprehensively. It's easy to see where edge gets taken too far in other works, but a lot harder to notice in our own. I think the key is that it has to serve the story. It doesn't necessarily need a deep, meaningful, metaphorical purpose, but it has to be carefully applied. One great tip that I love as far as dialogue goes is to read it all out loud. See if it sounds natural. It's one of the big giveaways in stories that are too edgy. There are a lot of thought-provoking, unnerving, and fun ways to use darkness, and you don't want to be afraid of edge. Rather, you want to use it in moderation. It lets you explore mature themes and ideas, but you always run the risk of pushing it too far. There's a thin line between cool and cringy, and it can be a hard one to skirt. I think one good exercise would be to make a list of stories that you think are good examples and those you think didn't quite nail it. Try to figure out what made each one work or not work and try to take that into your own work. And always be willing to take a second look at your story, retool things, and come at it from different angles to see if the one you chose is really for the best. Hopefully that was somewhat clear and at least gives you an idea of how to approach this. Truth be told, it seemed a lot easier when I was thinking about it, but in writing I found out that there's a lot of aspects to this topic and not a lot of clear definition to how to do it right. So hopefully this video can at least be a jumping off point to further our thinking. Thanks for watching this episode of Storycraft. If you liked this video, please give it a like. If you have any comments for future topics you'd like me to cover, leave them in the comment section below. Subscribe if you want to see more videos, and I will see you soon.